So students are being denied the chance of moving into luxury accommodation just before the start of their academic year. But the rooms won't be empty. No, that's right, because the Home Office is reportedly looking to move asylum seekers, obviously, into a 405-bed student block in Huddersfield that features all things, a cinema room, a gym. It's got all sorts, this place, really, it has, hasn't it? Which usually costs around £10,000 a year. It comes amid increasing pressure on student housing near university campuses, and Shadow Immigration Minister Stephen Kinnock argues that students are paying the price for the government's reliance on emergency accommodation. Yeah, all right, fine. But what about just the general safety risk of cramming a load of people who have just arrived to this country, potentially? We don't necessarily know exactly who they are or where they're from. Or you can almost guarantee the vast majority of them are going to be men, and plonking them near an area that is going to be populated by quite a lot of young, boozed-up women. But Nick Hillman is the director of the Higher Education Policy Institute and joins me now. Nick, can this really be happening, that university students who've quite possibly gone through an education system here, got the grades, in some cases it says here actually secured a tenancy agreement at a very nice student block, are being booted out for asylum seekers?
I am very, very surprised by this story. I've never come across anything quite like it. These students had signed contracts, were getting ready to move in for the new academic year, and they've had the rug literally pulled from under their feet. I think it's very strange, and I think it reflects the fact that students often fall through the gaps between different government departments. The Home Office doesn't particularly care about students, but sadly, the Education Department and the Housing Department haven't fixed this either.
I mean, it just seems absolutely bizarre, though, doesn't it? That surely there must be other forms of accommodation. How can it be right that students turfed out, just before the start of an academic year, but also, in some cases, still being made to live in proximity? I mean, I can see this coming now, that I'm going to end up talking about a story in the not-too-distant future where there has been some kind of desperately sad situation occurring involving somebody who's just arrived to this country and somebody who has been a vulnerable student, potentially in a state of distress after a night out.
Well, I think there's a lot of sense in what you say, of course. We expected the Home Office to use some unused student accommodation blocks, but this is not an unused student accommodation block. This is a student accommodation block that's been pretty full in recent years, and Huddersfield was recently, earlier this week, declared to be at amber risk, orange risk, of not having enough student beds this year. So I don't think this is the right solution to fix the Home Office's problem of course, not processing people quickly enough and deciding what to do with them.
So you think that this area was already struggling for student accommodation then, initially, and then now this has made it worse?
Well, if you'd asked me a few weeks ago, I would have said Huddersfield actually probably did have a bit of spare accommodation. But as I say, earlier this week, the guy who knows more about student accommodation than anybody else alive, a man called Martin Blakey, said Huddersfield was at amber risk of running out of rooms. And that's partly because students live in Huddersfield when they're studying in other places too. Some Manchester students live in Huddersfield, for example. Not only Huddersfield students who live in Huddersfield.
I just find it absolutely bonkers that the only human rights that seem to be preserved in this country are the human rights of people who have arrived here illegally. I mean, we've got students who have supposedly signed contracts saying that this is theirs for the year, will have paid a decent amount of money for it, will have worked very hard to get to the situation where they can actually get to a university to study, to rack up a lifetime's worth of debt, and then they have the opportunity to live in a place with a gym and a cinema room, and instead people are now just going to be moving in despite the fact that they've only just arrived here. I find it absolutely bonkers. What about the human rights of the students? I'll tell you what will be fascinating, though, is that I imagine that the demographics of the students would normally be the #refugees welcome brigade. Perhaps that might change if they start to see this affecting them.
Well, actually, some of the students in that block would have been highly likely to be international students themselves. So this is not necessarily Brits versus people from other countries. Many of them will have been international students. What I would like to see is the Home Office sitting round a table with the Education Department, with the Housing Department, with universities, and actually all the heads being knocked together to come to a more sensible solution than kicking students out who've signed a contract, who deserve to have some accommodation that they've got ready to pay for. Some money has already changed hands and they're having to have refunds. Where are those students going to live now? I hope they'll find somewhere else to live, but term starts pretty soon.
Term starts pretty soon, and I think anybody can see that if accommodation should cost around £10,000 a year, I'm sorry, but I think that is probably a bit too good to be being used for the current situation that we have at the moment.